Villa Lugano, a stretch of houses with faded facades and dusty streets, seemed frozen in time. The city of Buenos Aires gleamed at its vibrant core. But here, to the south, the shadow of poverty blended with the constant noise of motorcycles and vans speeding by. The streets were crowded, people walking briskly, lost in their thoughts, trying to escape a reality that seemed to offer no hope. In the neighborhood, drug trafficking and youth gangs were a constant presence. The tired faces of old bars, the alleys winding through concrete high-rises, children playing in the streets without a certain future. The thin palm trees on Osvaldo Miro Avenue, rising between dust and cement, symbolized resilience, but also solitude. And it was here, among the gray houses and busy streets, that Santiago grew up. A boy who, like many, found himself living in a place where the dream of a better life often seemed out of reach. But in that chaotic world, every step was a fight, every breath a hope. While for him and his brother Martín, the neighbors were just neighbors, for the police, many of those same people were targets. There were dealers, drug traffickers, prostitutes, and even men in suits and ties lurking in the shadows, managing businesses that should never have been seen by outsiders. Every corner of the street had its secret, and Santiago knew it well. His childhood wasn't made of innocent games and dreams of the future, but of whispers through cracked doors and eyes watching every move. The law enforcement would arrive, but they weren't always welcome. Sometimes it seemed as if the neighborhood had its own rules, and those who tried to break them ended up becoming part of them. Despite everything, though, life in Villa Lugano went on, day after day, fueled by the hope of those like Santiago, looking for a way out, but not always knowing how to find it. Santiago's parents were not people to look up to. They were an unstable couple. His father was involved in drug trafficking, and his mother often didn't come home at night. They argued frequently, and when Santiago was 9 years old, his father took Santiago's older brother and moved to the other side of the city. Santiago stayed with his mother, and from that moment on, he saw many men come and go from their house. Sometimes his mother asked him to sleep over at a friend's house. That friend, Julián, lived not far from Santiago's home, just a few streets away. For Santiago, Julián was like a brother, especially since he no longer saw his own. The two boys spent hours playing truco, an Argentine card game that required sharp thinking and a good poker face. They sat on the floor or at Julián's small kitchen table, laughing and arguing over who had the better strategy. After the games ended, they talked late into the night about their dreams and what life might hold for them. Julián often spoke of becoming a famous soccer player, imagining himself on the field with the entire stadium chanting his name. Santiago, though quieter, listened intently, wondering if he could ever find a way out of Villa Lugano's tough streets. It was a hot summer evening, and the streets of Villa Lugano were livelier than ever, filled with voices, noises, and the smell of fried food coming from the stalls on the corners. Santiago was playing truco with Julián in his courtyard when a sudden burst of gunfire ripped through the air. They jumped up, their hearts pounding. Santiago looked at Julián, who seemed frozen, his eyes wide open and the cards slipping from his hands. Soon after, the sound of sirens and screams filled the night. Santiago followed Julián, who ran desperately toward his house only to find a crowd of neighbors gathered outside. The police were already there, cordoning off the scene with yellow tape. Julián pushed through the crowd and shouted his parents' names, but no one answered. The officers stopped him before he could enter, while some whispered among the people that it was a settling of scores, an attack linked to the drug trade. His parents had been hit by mistake, victims of a war they hadn't chosen. Julián stood still, tears streaming down his face while Santiago tried to comfort him, not knowing what to say. Shortly after, social workers arrived. Julián, who had no other relatives, was taken away that very night. Santiago watched the orphanage van disappear into the darkness, feeling helpless, with a knot in his stomach. From that day on, his life was never the same. Julián, his best friend, his brother at heart, was gone, leaving a void that Villa Lugano would never be able to fill. In neighborhoods like Villa Lugano, children grow up faster. They understand and learn many things earlier than their peers raised in wealthy and economically stable families. Life's harsh realities force them to navigate a world filled with challenges and dangers, where survival often takes precedence over innocence. They learn to read people, to interpret unspoken rules, and to find ways to protect themselves in an environment that rarely offers second chances. For them, childhood is fleeting, replaced too soon by the responsibilities and resilience of adulthood. That's why Santiago knew exactly what life in an orphanage would be like for his friend. He understood the loneliness, the struggle to trust, and the fight to carve out a space in a world that never seemed fair. As Julián was taken away, Santiago felt the weight of that knowledge pressing down on him, knowing his friend's life would never be the same. A couple of times a year, Santiago's mother took him to visit Julián. Each time the meeting was an emotional moment. Julián, now grown and changed by circumstances, talked about his life in the orphanage, his hopes, his struggles, but also the small dreams he tried to nurture despite everything. Santiago listened in silence, feeling the bond that had never broken, even though time and distance had separated their lives. In an orphanage, daily life was governed by precise rules, many of which were written while others, more tacit, were dictated by the children's experience. From the moment you arrived, it was clear that each child had a place and a role within the group, a delicate balance that could not be broken without consequences. Punishments were part of this order, though not always fair or just. Every infraction, whether it was a misplaced word or a behavior deemed unacceptable, was punished by the deprivation of small freedoms, such as recess time or access to toys. Sometimes punishment wasn't so much about discipline as it was about maintaining balance among the children themselves, who often became the silent judges of one another's actions. The rules among the children were just as rigid. There was an unspoken code that determined who was the leader, who was the most vulnerable, and who should stay in the background. The hierarchies weren't written down but were established through looks, gestures, and sometimes small tests of strength or courage. The older children typically had unquestioned authority, and although they sometimes recognized the injustices, they didn't intervene so as not to lose their status. The spaces were shared, yet every corner, every desk, every bed had an invisible ownership tied to who had occupied it the longest. Anyone who dared to enter someone else's territory might have found themselves facing silent disdain or open disapproval from the others. Amidst all this, however, there were also small acts of solidarity, moments when one child spoke up for others, trying to defend the weaker ones or making it clear that a rule didn't always make sense. But these were rare moments, not always met positively by the other children, who viewed loyalty to the rules as a way to secure their place in the complex power game played every day. While waiting for his friend to come out, Santiago observed the eyes of the children who lived there. The eyes of the younger ones were sad and dull, as if the weight of loneliness and loss was already too much for them. The older ones, on the other hand, seemed like lions in a cage. In their gazes you could read the aggression toward life and the outside world, as if they were trying to survive in a place that had never truly embraced them, but had forced them to grow up too quickly. It was in those moments that Santiago decided that, when he grew up, he wanted to work in an orphanage. He wanted to support kids like his friend, offer them a helping hand, and become the figure of hope and guidance that he himself had sought. He wanted to be someone who could ease some of the pain he saw in their eyes, helping them find a path and believe that, despite everything, a better future was still possible. Santiago knew that his path wouldn't be easy, but his determination was stronger than any difficulty. Growing up in a modest family, he had never had the luxury of attending private schools or affording extra lessons. However, the opportunity to study without paying tuition fees thanks to the public university in Buenos Aires gave him real hope. As soon as he finished high school, Santiago decided to enter university, but he knew he would face huge challenges to support himself. His family couldn't help him financially, so he started working right away. During the day, he took on odd jobs, delivering packages, working in a grocery store, and in the summer, he tutored children in the neighborhood in mathematics and Spanish. In the evenings, he studied late into the night, trying to keep up with the university program. Despite the exhaustion, Santiago never gave up. Occasionally, he managed to get a scholarship based on his academic merits, which helped cover some of the costs for books and materials. He also found low-cost university dormitories, where his life was divided between classes, work, and study. There were times when he thought about giving up. The sleepless nights and the sacrifices made him doubt, but he always remembered the promise he had made to himself as a child, the one to help others, like Julián. Every time he looked at his classmates, he thought about how important it would be for him to become a supportive figure for troubled kids. This thought pushed him to keep going. In the end, after years of hard work, Santiago graduated with a degree in education sciences, not without difficulties, but with a strength that no external circumstance could stop. He was ready to enter an orphanage and give everything he had to help the kids who needed someone to believe in them. Santiago worked in the orphanage for 5 years. Every day within the walls of that place, he felt like one of them, one of the kids who lived there. Over time, those kids had become his family, and the affection he felt for them was immense. Every face he encountered, every story he listened to, made him feel even more connected to them, as if their suffering was his own. Among them, he formed a particular bond with Alejandro, a 17-year-old who loved music and dreamed of becoming a DJ. Alejandro wasn't afraid to use his cleverness to get by. He wasn't shy about speaking his mind, even when his words were harsh, and his anger pushed him to constantly challenge the rules. His parents were drug addicts who had left him to grow up alone, but Alejandro didn't need pity. He was sharp, resourceful, and had a huge passion for music, and Santiago understood him. From time to time they'd sit and talk, exchanging ideas and dreams. Another boy Santiago grew close to was Matias, 16 years old. Matias was a strong presence, never going unnoticed. His mother had died after giving birth to him, and his father, drunk from morning to night, had left him to grow up without a real role model. When social services took him in, Matias already had a lot of anger inside, which he often expressed in defiant and sometimes provocative behavior. He didn't let anyone walk over him and often asked questions that made people uncomfortable. The two boys were the undisputed leaders of the orphanage. No one could pass by unnoticed without them seeing. They were always alert with sharp eyes, ready to catch every little change around them. Their influence was felt throughout the place. Everyone respected them, some feared them, but no one dared challenge them. Alejandro, with his sharp intellect and passion for music, and Matias, with his overwhelming anger and survival instinct, shared a bond that made them invincible. One day, during one of their usual meals in the cafeteria, while everyone was busy eating, one of them, despite the casual atmosphere, dropped a statement that froze the room. Alejandro, looking at the others with his proud gaze, said, "Anyway, in a few months this place won't exist anymore." His voice was calm, but the words hit like a heavy weight. Matias, sitting beside him, nodded with a grimace, as if confirming what they already knew. The news spread through the room in an instant, but no one dared ask any questions. Santiago, sitting at one end of the table, immediately realized something was changing, that the orphanage was about to face a new challenge. Knowing that when the boys made statements like that, there was always something behind it, Santiago decided to take action. He couldn't just stay silent. He needed to understand what was really happening. When Santiago entered the director's office, the man's exhaustion was clear, and there was no surprise in his eyes when he saw him. It was obvious he had already known Santiago would come. The director explained that the municipality had given them 6 months to find a new place for all the children, as there were no more funds to keep the orphanage running. He had tried to find a solution, but the reality was that the funding had dried up, and they couldn't keep the doors open any longer. Santiago listened in silence, the weight of the news sinking in. It wasn't just a bureaucratic decision. It was a tragedy for the kids who had made this place their home. The thought that some of them, like Alejandro and Matias, would be sent to places where they wouldn't be understood, where they wouldn't feel safe, was devastating. He knew that without the orphanage, their lives would become even more uncertain. When Santiago returned to the boys, he tried to remain calm, but the weight of the news had shaken him. He told them he had confirmed that the closure of the orphanage was a bureaucratic issue, a decision made due to a lack of funds. Santiago felt powerless, unable to find a way out. There was nothing he could do, nothing that could change that sad reality. The boys who lived there, who had now become his family, would be scattered in other places. He thought about how difficult it would be for them to adapt to new structures, far from what they knew, from what they had built together. Santiago felt betrayed by the system, angry with the municipality, and with anyone who had decided that there were no resources to continue supporting the orphanage. He had dedicated his life to that place, to the boys who lived there, and now everything he had built was about to be destroyed for the simple lack of funds. But he couldn't give up. He had seen in those boys hope, strength, and he wouldn't allow it all to end like this. He decided that no matter how difficult it was, he would fight to the very end to try to find a solution. It wasn't just a matter of bureaucracy. For him, it was a fight for the future of those boys he now considered his family. He couldn't allow their fate to be decided without doing anything. When Santiago returned to the boys, he tried to stay calm, but the weight of the news was crushing him. He told them that the closure of the orphanage was truly due to a lack of funds, a bureaucratic issue that no one could stop. There was no money to keep the place open, and that reality was becoming unavoidable. But as he spoke, his gaze met Alejandro's, who didn't seem surprised. In fact, Alejandro looked at him for a moment with a sort of understanding, as if he had already known the situation would end this way. Santiago felt powerless, unable to find a way out. There was nothing he could do, nothing that would change that harsh reality. The boys who lived there, who had become his family, would be scattered to other places. He thought about how difficult it would be for them to adjust to new facilities, far from what they knew, from what they had built together. Santiago felt betrayed by the system, angry with the municipality, and with anyone who had decided there were no resources to continue running the orphanage. He had dedicated his life to that place, to the boys who lived there, and now everything he had built was about to be destroyed simply because of a lack of funds. But he couldn't give up. He decided that no matter how difficult it was, he would fight to the very end to find a solution. This wasn't just a bureaucratic issue. For him, it was a fight for the future of those boys he considered his own children. He couldn't let their fate be decided without doing anything. The following day, Santiago began researching where to go and who to contact regarding the closure of the orphanage. He knew he had to act quickly, but he had no idea where to start. He decided to reach out to the offices responsible for social policies and child welfare, such as the Department of Social Services and the Ministry of Family and Social Policies. In these offices, he hoped to at least have a chance to explain the situation and find a solution. However, the treatment he received was far from what he had hoped for. Every time he entered an office, the staff seemed more interested in getting rid of him than in finding a solution. He felt rejected and treated with disdain. Doors were slammed in his face without a word of courtesy, and the responses were always the same. There is no funding. There's nothing that can be done. Every time he tried to explain the importance of the orphanage for the kids, he was told that the money had run out and there was nothing more to be done. Santiago felt powerless and frustrated. When Santiago returned from yet another meeting, exhausted and disheartened, he found Alejandro sitting at the communal table with a serious expression. Without saying a word, Alejandro threw a newspaper onto the table, sliding it toward him. Santiago, confused, picked it up and noticed Alejandro's expression, determined and intense. In the newspaper, a front-page story immediately caught his attention, but it was the headline on the second page that hit him like a punch to the stomach. The third bank robbery in 5 months. Police suspect the Banda del Oeste. Alejandro crossed his arms, looking at him intently, as if waiting for a reaction. Santiago, still in disbelief, realized that Alejandro had something in mind. There was no need for words to understand that the boy had already crafted a plan in his head, one that promised to be as risky as it was desperate. When Santiago read the news and saw the name of the gang potentially involved, he burst out laughing. The Banda del Oeste, infamous throughout Argentina, had cemented its reputation as one of the most elusive and daring criminal groups in the country. Operating primarily in the western suburbs of Buenos Aires, they were experts in planning bank heists that often unfolded like scenes from a carefully choreographed movie. Their operations were characterized by meticulous timing, detailed surveillance of their targets, and an uncanny ability to anticipate police movements. What made the Banda del Oeste particularly notorious was their apparent discipline and lack of unnecessary violence. While they were armed and dangerous, they rarely harmed civilians, preferring to rely on speed, strategy, and psychological tactics to control situations. Witnesses often reported how the gang communicated through coded phrases and hand signals, a testament to their military-style coordination. Their methods included disabling alarm systems, creating diversionary tactics to draw police away from their actual target, and using stolen vehicles with false license plates to evade capture. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the gang always seemed one step ahead. Police speculated that the Banda del Oeste had insider connections or informants who provided critical information, further complicating efforts to apprehend them. Their exploits became a source of both fear and fascination for the public, with newspapers regularly covering their heists and the authorities' inability to stop them. Tired, Santiago retreated to his room hoping to find some peace. However, the boy's words lingered in his mind, echoing like a relentless whisper that refused to fade. He slept poorly, troubled by thoughts he couldn't shake off. The next day, when he finally got up, he found a sealed letter from the municipality in his mailbox. His heart raced as he opened it, dreading the confirmation of what he already suspected. The letter officially communicated the closure of the orphanage due to lack of funds. The municipality could no longer cover the expenses, and all the children had to be transferred to other facilities within 6 months. Alejandro's words no longer seemed like nonsense to him. All day long, they saw Santiago lost in thought and distant. The next day, Santiago returned to his neighborhood, where it all began. He walked through the streets he knew so well, surrounded by old friends and acquaintances, some of whom he'd only seen in years. The anger he felt inside, born from the realization that without money you were nothing in the system, made him more determined than ever. He knew he had to gather information about the Banda del Oeste, understand how they operated, and perhaps find a way to use the same tactics they had used. He stopped to talk to those who were once his friends, some of whom had been involved in crime, others who had simply witnessed the transformation of the neighborhood from a distance. The conversations were casual, but each word was a piece of a puzzle he was trying to solve. Occasionally, a name, a clue, a phrase casually mentioned, added to his search. Some spoke to him with suspicion, others looked at him with a mix of admiration and concern, knowing that Santiago had always had a different view on life, but unaware of how he would react to the corruption that now seemed to dominate the world. The more he talked, the more he understood that the Banda del Oeste wasn't just about money or violence. It was a well-oiled machine, built on deception and compromises, thriving on what the system failed to offer those who lived in neighborhoods like his. The gang had built its power on the inadequacy of a system that offered no alternatives, and Santiago, more than ever, wanted to understand every mechanism behind it. The most important members of the Banda del Oeste were 3 individuals whose skills and personalities defined the gang's notorious reputation. Each brought something unique to the table, making the gang a force to be reckoned with. Raul Chiflo Fernandez was considered one of the main leaders of the gang, renowned for his cunning and his ability to meticulously plan heists down to the smallest detail. His sharp mind and strategic thinking made him a mastermind behind many successful robberies. Carlos El Loco Maciel was another prominent member of the gang, known for his cold demeanor and his tough, unyielding attitude. He had a reputation for being unpredictable and ruthless when necessary, and his intimidating presence made him a key figure in their operations. Hector El Polaco Silva was regarded as one of the most dangerous members of the gang, recognized for his skill in executing heists without leaving a trace. His ability to stay calm under pressure and his expert knowledge of security systems made him an invaluable asset to the crew. However, one question remained unclear. How could Santiago leverage all this to his advantage? When, all of a sudden, an acquaintance from the neighborhood asked him if he knew that his brother was part of the gang. Santiago froze. His heart skipped a beat as the weight of the words sank in. He hadn't expected that. His mind raced, trying to process what this meant. Santiago hadn't seen his brother in years, and he had no news of him. Now, hearing that his brother might be involved with the Banda del Oeste was like a sudden shock to the system. Now, Santiago had a plan. Since he knew nothing about how to rob a bank without getting caught, Santiago's plan began to take shape. He would infiltrate the gang through his brother and learn from its members how to pull off a perfect heist. He knew it wasn't going to be easy, and the risks were immense, but he felt a surge of determination. The more he thought about it, the more the idea made sense. Santiago sat at the table in the bar, his heart racing. He hadn't seen his brother in years, but today he had finally tracked him down. The man before him wasn't the boy he remembered, but a man weathered by time and experiences. His face bore the marks of the struggles and violence he had lived through, yet Santiago recognized him immediately. It had been a long time since they'd last met, and Santiago thought his brother might want nothing to do with him, but the reality was different. His brother offered Santiago the option to join the gang if he was interested. He explained that he would speak to Raul, one of the leaders, to see what could be done. It wasn't going to be easy, but Santiago was ready. With his brother's help, Santiago managed to infiltrate the Banda del Oeste, not as a leader, but as a newcomer. He needed to prove himself, earn the gang's trust. Over the following months, he immersed himself fully in the gang's operations. He watched, listened, and studied their every move, learning how they operated, how they coordinated. He quickly understood the mechanics of the heists, the precision, the timing, the strategy. The gang worked like a well-oiled machine, but Santiago began to form his own plan. Santiago, after infiltrating the Banda del Oeste through his brother, began to fully understand the magnitude of the plan that was being prepared. His life, which he had dedicated to helping the children at the orphanage, seemed distant now. But inside, one thought continued to haunt him. The orphanage was about to close, and without money the children would be sent to other facilities, possibly less secure. He couldn't let that happen. Meanwhile, Alejandro and Matias, two boys Santiago had met during his time at the orphanage, began to suspect that something was wrong. Their educator, who had always encouraged and protected them, was suddenly involved in a world of crime. They didn't understand what was happening, but they felt that his choice hid something bigger, something that concerned them all. 2 months later, the gang decided it was time for a big heist, a bank known for holding large sums of money. They chose March 15th, knowing that mid-month was when pensions were distributed. On that day, banks were usually loaded with cash. Santiago knew this was his moment, not just to prove himself, but to execute his own plan. Santiago believed he had considered every detail of the plan. However, he had no idea that his childhood friend Julián had become a police officer, driven by the trauma of losing his parents in a violent gang shooting. Moreover, he had been keeping a close watch on the gang for a long time. A week before the robbery, Alejandro and Matias approached Santiago on a quiet street in the neighborhood, their expressions serious and almost accusatory. They asked him where he had disappeared to, and why he no longer showed up at the orphanage. Caught off guard, Santiago tried to deflect the conversation, but the two boys were persistent. They already knew that their former mentor had joined the most feared gang in the country, but wanted to hear it from him. Santiago, torn between shame and pride, admitted the truth, keeping his real motives hidden. Despite their initial shock, Alejandro and Matias asked Santiago to involve them, whichever was his plan. They didn't want to be left behind. Growing up in a harsh environment had toughened them. After a long discussion, Santiago reluctantly agreed, but only if they followed his rules. He incorporated them into the plan as crucial players. The following week, the plan took shape. Santiago prepared meticulously, though he knew things could still go wrong. The gang settled on 11 a.m. as the perfect time to carry out the bank heist, believing the late morning would give them enough time to prepare while avoiding peak activity. Santiago, however, had a different plan. He intended to arrive at 9 a.m., 2 hours ahead of schedule. Unlike the seasoned members of the gang, Santiago lacked the experience they had accumulated over years of criminal activities. He also knew he wasn't entirely alone. Alejandro and Matias would be with him. However, neither of them had any experience in robbery. This only added to the weight on his shoulders. Santiago felt a double responsibility, not just for himself but also for guiding and protecting his inexperienced companions. Alejandro had always been disobedient at the orphanage, often ignoring rules and acting on his own impulses. This trait worried Santiago, who knew how crucial it was for everyone to stick to the plan. He couldn't shake the fear that Alejandro might decide to improvise at a critical moment, putting the entire operation and their safety at risk. Matias, on the other hand, was more level-headed and had a knack for figuring things out on the fly, but his youth and inexperience made him prone to mistakes. On the day of the heist, another person was awake and alert from the crack of dawn. It was Julián, Santiago's childhood best friend, who, as a police officer, had been carrying out an investigation into the gang. That morning, when he saw Santiago leaving a house, something about his friend's behavior struck him as odd. His hurried steps, his nervous glances. Julián's instincts told him to follow. He couldn't shake the feeling that Santiago was hiding something, and as much as he wanted to trust his old friend, the strange circumstances demanded answers. Quietly and cautiously, Julián set off after him, determined to uncover the truth. On the day of the robbery, Santiago took a deep breath, slipped on his mask, and grabbed the gun. With a sense of determination, he stepped forward, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Alejandro put on the mask and with a determined step, entered the bank alongside Santiago. As his friend moved toward the main area, Alejandro took his position near the counter, ready to play his part in the plan. Everything seemed under control. Meanwhile, Matias took his position, posing as a fake hostage, blending in seamlessly with the unfolding scene. Alejandro had a specific role: to convince the bank manager to open the vault by threatening to kill Matias, who played the part of the victim with incredible realism. Their performance worked, and the terrified manager complied. Meanwhile, Santiago coordinated every move with precision, ensuring each action was timed to the second. He filled the bags quickly, his hands moving with practiced precision despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Once they were packed, he gave a final glance around the bank, ensuring everything was in place. With the heavy bags in hand, Santiago made his way out. But the plan took an unexpected turn when, exiting the bank with the money, Santiago found himself face to face with his brother. The gang leader, suspicious of Santiago's movements, had sent his brother to check on the situation early. Santiago froze for a moment, his heart racing. His brother stared at him, and Santiago saw a flash of disappointment in his eyes. The situation quickly escalated when another gang member, who had been sitting in a car with Santiago's brother, suddenly raised his gun and began shooting. In the confusion, Santiago was struck, a sharp pain shooting through his body as he staggered, realizing the gravity of the situation. In the ensuing chaos, a police car screeched to a halt in front of the scene. Santiago immediately recognized the man behind the wheel, Julián, his childhood friend. Julián wasted no time and signaled Santiago to get in. Santiago didn't need an explanation. He understood that Julián, despite everything, was there to help him. Meanwhile, Alejandro and Matias had already slipped away with the money, following a prearranged escape route. Julián, who had been quietly observing from a distance, had already called for reinforcements. He urgently reported that the gang was in the process of assaulting the bank, giving the police a heads up. Within moments, sirens wailed in the distance and the police arrived swiftly, surrounding the area with a speed that left the gang with little time to react. By using his position, he covered Santiago's escape, skillfully redirecting police reinforcements and drawing their attention toward the original gang members. The chaos unfolded. Julián knew he had risked everything for his friend, and as he drove, he couldn't help but ask one question, his voice low and steady. Why? Santiago, bloodied and exhausted, gave a single heavy answer. Orphanage. At that moment, Julián understood everything. All those years of conversations, those rare visits, when they were children, when Santiago would come to see him and speak of his dreams. suddenly made sense. He remembered how, back then, Sebastian had often said that when he grew up, he wanted to work with orphaned children. It was a simple wish, but it had always stuck with Julián. Now it was clear Santiago had done all of this not for money or power, but for the orphanage, the place that had shaped him into the person he was. It was a sacrifice, one that meant turning against a dangerous gang and betraying his own brother, all for a cause he had quietly believed in since he was a child. Santiago managed to carry out his plan successfully, but not without consequences. The two boys, Alejandro and Matias, were identified and put on trial for their involvement in the robbery. However, since the stolen money was never found and considering their young age and mitigating circumstances, the court decided to impose a lighter sentence, focused on rehabilitation and community service. Meanwhile, Santiago's brother and some members of the gang were captured by the police during a subsequent raid, thanks to information provided by Santiago himself. Santiago, as a gesture of trust and a desire to put his past behind him, shared with Julián everything he knew about the gang leaders, from their hideouts to their illegal operations. Armed with this information, the authorities managed to strike a decisive blow, arresting the gang leaders and dismantling their criminal network. With nearly $20 million stolen during the heist, Santiago was able to save the orphanage from closing, ensuring that the children had a safe place to grow up. Although his path had been dangerous and morally ambiguous, he ultimately found a way to provide a better future for those who needed it most. Julián, while not approving of his methods, understood his intentions and chose not to reveal Santiago's direct involvement in the theft, believing that the good done outweighed the wrong. Following the information provided by Santiago, law enforcement was able to track down and arrest Carlos Rodriguez, one of the feared leaders of the Banda del Oeste. His capture came after a string of raids across Buenos Aires, severely weakening the gang's operations. Santiago's role was pivotal, as he had given key details about the gang's hideouts and operations, ultimately leading to Rodriguez's arrest. This marked a turning point in the crackdown on organized crime in the region, as Rodriguez had been one of the most elusive and dangerous figures in Argentina's criminal underworld. His capture was seen as a significant victory for law enforcement. For Santiago, in the end, it wasn't the victory against the gang or the loss of the past that defined him. It was the realization that all roads, even the ones paved with mistakes, might ultimately lead to a place of understanding. He wondered whether, at some point, one had to embrace the complexity of their own story, chaotic, flawed, and imperfect, as a form of true freedom. With a final glance at the city that had been his battleground, Santiago understood something crucial. Redemption was not a destination, but a continuous journey of making choices, facing their consequences, and understanding the essence of who he had become in the process. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.